Welcome to the British Interplanetary Society's first live streaming Q&A session. Well, that's not quite true, as we've been live streaming all our evening lectures to our members around the world from our headquarters in Vauxhall, London, for almost a year now. But this is the first time we've gone public. We plan to do this or something similar every week now until this pandemic is over. Now tonight, we are marking the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 13 mission. I hope you have all had the chance to watch David Baker's excellent Apollo 13 lecture, first given back in 2013, but as relevant now as ever. We already have a number of questions, but if you want to ask any more, please email me on streaming@bis-space.com. Now, we're fortunate tonight in having our resident expert, Jerry Stone, with us to answer your questions. He's been studying the Apollo missions for over 50 years, and I think I'll hand over to him in a moment because I've got to go and look for those questions. And over to you, Jerry. Tell us what you're about.
Well, good evening, everyone. Nice to be virtually with you. I've been giving a presentation about each of the Apollo missions to mark the 50th anniversary of each flight. I started with Apollo 7 back in October 2018, and I had just about reached Apollo 11, and but 3 days before I was due to that, I was taken into hospital for emergency surgery due to my previously unknown diabetes. The result was that I managed to do Apollo 11 in October, just before I did Apollo 12, and I would have been doing Apollo 13 this evening, but circumstances have put paid to that. But I'm sure that you will absolutely enjoy the recording that we have of a presentation by David Baker, of course, the editor of Spaceflight magazine, and who personally worked on the Apollo program. This is a presentation from 2013, all about the mission. And as Alistair said, following that, I'm going to hopefully be able to answer your questions. We had a few sent in. If you want to send any more, then please do, using the address that you've been given. And if we're ready to start with the video, I'm going to hand back to Alistair.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Jerry. I hope you can all see me again. What I'd like to do then, Jerry, can I start off with my own question? It's really about the lessons learned from Apollo 13. It was an amazing mission, or ended up being an amazing mission. How did the lessons learned benefit the rest of the Apollo missions?
Well, first of all, I think I'll quote Kevin Fong. A name will be familiar to many of you. He said that the great thing about Apollo 13 was that it wasn't done by improvisation, but because they had done so much advanced planning. They knew what to do when things went wrong. What they didn't know was how much could go wrong. And in fact, up until Apollo 13, if the astronauts were in a simulator and they had been thrown that kind of situation at them, a quadruple failure, the staff would have said, well, no, we're not going to give them that, because that couldn't possibly happen. You're losing power, oxygen, water, and you lost the whole command module. They said that there's no way that would actually happen, so it isn't realistic to spend time for them rehearsing something like that. After Apollo 13, the rules were changed, and it was said, you can come up with anything you want and we'll look at it. And that was quite something. A direct lesson that you could say we learned, if you look at the new spacecraft, the one that's being taken or being built to send people back to the moon, it's going to have a command module rather like Apollo but larger, and it will have a service module which is actually going to be built by the European Space Agency. And what makes that look very different is it will have solar panels. So if onboard power isn't directly available, there'll be a solar power backup. And I mean, that's the big thing with NASA, is always backups to backups to backups. But with Apollo 13, you had this critical point of failure, which was the oxygen tanks, as we will find out.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Jerry. I think we've got some more questions coming in, but I'd like to start off with one actually from someone who's fairly local to us and actually listening in at the moment. And that is Alan Marlowe, who actually asked the question, following the difficulties they had on Apollo 13, do you know if they redesigned the lithium hydroxide filters so that they were interchangeable between the command module and the lunar module?
Well, the big thing about this, this is literally a case of fitting a round peg in a square hole, because the spare lithium hydroxide canisters that were in the command module wouldn't fit the holder for the lunar module, for the filter holder in the lunar module. One set was round, one set was square. The two spacecraft were built by completely different companies, and nobody saw any reason why you would need to swap the filters between the two craft. It would have taken a lot of time and effort and change to have completely redesigned the filter holders for subsequent missions. So no, to the best of my knowledge, no, they didn't. But they would have known, of course, how to make them fit if needed, because they'd already done it. And in fact, that procedure was not just sort of cooked up as a result of what happened on Apollo 13. There were people who had actually practiced that in advance. So they had thought about even this incredibly remote eventuality and done some preparation for it.
Thank you again, Jerry. Right, well, we've got one that I would describe as being slightly, well, looking to the future. We hope it's the near future. And it's from Susan in West Wales. And she says, how is the Artemis project performing going forwards? And do you anticipate that we will be returning to the moon in the very near future as planned?
Well, the original announcement about NASA returning to the moon set the date of 2028. And I have to say that my immediate reaction to that was, well, they want to get there before 2029, because that's that's an anniversary from 1969. But then it was brought forward, and the world was told America's going to get there by 2024. Now you have to think what's involved in doing that. The main thing is the booster, which is the Space Launch System. And developing something like that from scratch is not easy. I mean, it's the equivalent of redoing Saturn V, which was the most powerful rocket that ever launched people into space. And that had 2 unmanned test launches before it first carried men. And that first flight was directly to the moon, Apollo 8, in December 1968. So after that, there was Apollo 9 testing the lunar module in Earth orbit, Apollo 10 testing the lunar module but in lunar orbit, a dress rehearsal for the landing before Apollo 11. And then that was followed later that year by Apollo 12. So in the space of just about 14 months, you had in fact less than that, because I'm including Apollo 7 in that, which was on a Saturn 1B, not a Saturn V. December 1968 round to November 1969, you had 5 Saturn V launches, and the rate of launch for the SLS isn't planned to be anywhere near that. Well, actually, you wouldn't expect it to be, because there is no specific need to launch them at that kind of rate. So they'll just take a progressive approach to this. But even so, I mean, how many SLS units are under construction at the moment? I mean, with Apollo, you had 3 mobile launch platforms, each with the attendant mobile launch tower. And so one could be out on the pad ready to be launched, while another two were being stacked inside the vehicle assembly building. NASA just doesn't have that kind of capacity at the moment, so it'll take a while. How long? Well, there's due to be an unmanned test. There's due to be... just doesn't have that kind of capacity at the moment, so it'll take a while.
Sorry, that was my fault.
Okay.
Carry on, Jerry.
So, and then there's going to be an unmanned test. We're going to loop astronauts around the moon before we attempt another landing there. And at the moment, there's lots being shown about the progress of the command module and the service module. We don't as yet have a lunar module along the track that you would expect it to be able to be available for a test launch within, say, a year. It might take a couple more years than that, but then still that would take us to 2022, and that still leaves another 2 years before the target date of 2024 for landing. So a lot of speculation at the moment. I would say it's possible to do it, but we'll have to wait and see how things actually go. It's well, it isn't straightforward. I mean, after all, it is rocket science. It isn't easy.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Right, well, I've got some more questions coming in, and the one I've got here is from Les Shoulder, who says he's from far, far East London on the Essex borders, so fairly local, and he's a member of the BIS, as we all know. Apollo 13 was due to land on the moon at Fra Mauro site. This site was then used by Apollo 14. Apollo 14 was originally due to land at Taurus, Littrow. Source Praxis Manned Spaceflight Log 1961.
Yes.
To 2006. Then becoming the landing site for Apollo 17. Do we know what landing site would have been used if Apollo 13 had been a success?
Okay. Well, the details of the Apollo missions kept changing so much. Crews were changed. I mean, for example, Borman, Lovell and Anders flew to the moon on Apollo 8. They weren't supposed to. They were supposed to fly Apollo 9. But the Apollo 8 crew, Jim McDivitt, Dave Scott and Rusty Schweikart, had trained and trained and trained for a lunar module mission. But the lunar module wasn't ready. And it was obvious in latter half of 1968 that it wouldn't be ready for several more months. But NASA didn't want a long delay between flights after Apollo 7. And so the question was, well, why not fly Apollo 8 without the lunar module and take it to the moon and fly around the moon? And Deke Slayton, the head of the astronauts, decided if they're going to do that, he will not give that mission to McDivitt's crew. He will swap them from Apollo 8 to Apollo 9 so that they will have time for the lunar module to be ready and they will fly their lunar module mission. And instead he brought Apollo 9's crew forward to Apollo 8, Borman, Lovell and Anders. And when that happened, they took their backup crew with them, Armstrong, Aldrin and Collins. And under the standard of a backup crew skips the next 2 flights, and then flies as prime crew on the 3rd flight afterwards. That's why Armstrong, Aldrin and Collins became the prime crew for Apollo 11 instead of Apollo 12 as they would have been. So that took Pete Conrad out of being the first man on the moon, or sorry, to walk on the moon. So things change all the way down the line, and as one thing changes, it has a ripple effect further on. When Apollo 13 didn't land, that played around with all of the subsequent landing designations. And it was whilst the landing was still going on that they lost Apollo 20, and then 18 and 19, and that caused a crew change on Apollo 17. Taurus Littrow was always a major target, but others included Copernicus, the very bright ray crater in the Mare Imbrium, which is just slightly off the center of the moon, and even plans to land at Tycho crater, which is way towards the south pole of the moon. So it's a question of, with the others, what was the main target, what was the main reasons for going there? And as the missions advanced, the greater target was the science that would be achieved from them. And that was a major thing with the Apollo 13 target. The Fra Mauro area was composed of material from the Mare Imbrium basin, and that was something that scientists really wanted to get their hands on, figuratively speaking. So there was also then Cone Crater, which then became Apollo 14's target, and 15 Hadley Rill, 16 Descartes, the Lunar Highlands, that's where we'd never really been before, and 17 Taurus Littrow, as I've mentioned. Something that Ian Crawford has mentioned actually about that. When people ask, do we need to enter space? You know, aren't robots more efficient? Can't they operate for long periods? They don't need to be fed, so you don't need oxygen. Surely it's much safer to send them. And Ian Crawford pointed out that in just 3 days of Taurus Littrow, the Apollo 17 crew sampled not only from the valley floor, but from the mountains at the sides of the valley. They drilled below the surface and did seismic activity measurements and all kinds of other things. It was really quite incredible. And when it comes to the question of how you determine what the results are from any piece of scientific work, he said one way which is counted by most people is what the scientific reported research gives from it. In other words, how many scientific papers result from the project. And in that respect, Apollo, any single Apollo mission beats the unmanned exploration of the moon hands down. In addition, when the 2 Mars exploration rovers had been on the Red Planet for 6 months, I had the good fortune to speak with Steve Squires, who was the principal investigator. And I asked him, how long would it have taken an astronaut on Mars to do the same work that the 2 rovers together had achieved in the last 6 months each? And he knew the answer to that immediately. He said 3 days. The thing about having an astronaut there is that they can respond to the unexpected. So they might be doing some work, find something like orange soil on the moon on Apollo 17, and they can change their plans instantly. Right? They don't need reprogramming as such, but they can discuss things with mission control, and they can say, right, we're going to work on this for a bit. They can also look at 3 different rocks, and they might say, well, that type, we've seen lots of those already, we don't need to bother with that. This one looks interesting because A, B, and C. And then they might say, and this one, if I turn it over and see the side that's been protected from direct sunlight and whatever, he said, I'm going to find, etc., etc. And then, of course, there's Werner von Braun, who was asked why send men into space. And he said, yes, they can respond to the unexpected. They can learn from experience. And then he added, a human brain is the best computer we can send into space. And, of course, he added, they can be manufactured using unskilled labour.
Well, thank you very much, Jerry. We've got a lot more questions coming in, so I might have to ask you to speed up slightly on these. Les again has asked another question, and he's asking this time, Apollo 14 launched 9.5 months after the near disaster of Apollo 13 using 21st century health and safety. Well, actually, there should be a comma there. Using 21st century health and safety, would you like to speculate on how long the downtime might have been?
Well, I don't know, 9.5 months, you could say that is quite a fair amount of time. And I can tell you that NASA would not have launched if they weren't absolutely convinced that they were ready to do so. And in fact, they didn't spread out the remaining missions because they were actually learning so much from the results of each mission that they wanted more time to incorporate that into planning for the follow-on missions. So for anyone asking, how much did we learn from going to the moon so many times? The answer is one heck of a lot. But as for delay for health and safety reasons, yeah, I would have said that wasn't a problem. 9.5 months. That is a lot of time for thousands, really thousands of people to be working on things and making sure that it was all going to be okay.
Thank you very much, Jerry. We've got a lot more questions coming in, so we'll have to speed up slightly.
Okay.
We've got one here which is actually probably going to be a little bit, let's say interesting, from Rodney Buckland, who we all know, a member of the British Interplanetary Society and at the Open University. And he's asking, while watching the final stages of Apollo 13 mission on television, did Jim's mum really say to Neil and Buzz, "Are you two boys from NASA?"
Okay, I'm going to be absolutely honest here. I don't know precisely whether she did that. They were introduced to her in the film of Apollo 13. She said, "Are you boys in the space program too?" Which I thought was great. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But there are a couple of things in the film which were absolutely delightful. I think one of the best lines was one quoted by Marilyn Lovell when the TV stations wanted to put transmitters in front of her house. And she was a bit cheesed off that they hadn't bothered to take the TV transmission from Apollo 13, which took place just before the accident occurred. But now they were all over the place trying to get as much TV coverage as possible. And she said, no. And she was told, yeah, but people are more interested now. And she said, well, if landing on the moon wasn't interesting, why should not landing be interesting? And then she added this lovely line, they don't put one piece of equipment on my lawn. If they have a problem with that, they can take it up with my husband. He'll be home on Friday. I thought that showed great presence of mind.
Well, thank you for that one. That's one I hadn't heard before. Right, we've got one here from Robin Tucker, another member of the British Interplanetary Society. And Robin is asking, the famous scene in the Apollo 13 movie, where they work out how to convert the CO2 filter for the lunar module to work in the command module, throwing all the pieces on the table with duct tape, etc. Was that close to the truth, or had they already worked out how to do this as part of a contingency plan?
Okay, well, the scene there was really accurate. They picked out materials that they knew the astronauts would have on board the spacecraft, and they limited everything to that. They said, right, this is what they have to work with, let's come up with something. And as I've already mentioned, the idea of this had come up before, and so there had been some previous work on it, and that probably saved some time. I don't know whether they had come up with an actual working model before, but what they showed there was really accurate. And then they had to read up the instructions and get the astronaut, who of course couldn't see what had been done down on the ground. So it was all done purely over the radio. They had to follow the instructions and duplicate what had happened. And things didn't quite go right. For example, that they tore the duct tape accidentally, had to get another piece and so on. But yeah, that was a great piece in the film and very, very accurate.
Right, well, thank you very much. Now, I've got another one from Les Shoulder, still from the far, far east of London. He says, regarding spacecraft filters, did they take extra cartridges on later flights?
I'm not aware that they did, because, I mean, these filters were the ones that were meant to be used in the command module. But as the command module was totally powered down, you couldn't use that system. And so this is the situation that they were in. They were relying on power and the facilities of the lunar module, which was designed to take 2 people down to the moon and support them for 2 days. So that's 2 men, 2 days, 4-man days. Instead, it had to support 3 people for 4 days. That's 12-man days. And you look at it like that, and now you appreciate the enormity of the challenge. So although there were lots of spare filters, they were the command module's filters. On later flights, did they take extra lunar module filters? I don't believe so. They would have taken as many as they expected for that particular mission.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Right, we've got another question here from Mike Lawford in Harpenden, and he's actually asking, why didn't the Apollo 13 astronauts get another chance to go to the moon? Couldn't they have bumped a later crew off?
Well, that's not really NASA's policy, but in fact, Jim Swigert, who replaced Ken Mattingly as the command module pilot, had already decided he was going to leave NASA. Jim Lovell had announced before the flight that this would be his final mission. Fred Hayes subsequently flew approach and landing tests with the space shuttle and flew shuttle orbital missions. In fact, Jim became the first person to fly 4 space flights, which was a record that he held for some years. John Young became the first one to fly 5 times, and then the first to fly 6 times with his 2 flights on the. Really, crew wasn't going to remain together, so they wouldn't have flown a later flight together.
Right. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Jerry. Right. We've got another question, actually, from Colin in Milton Keynes, I think he is. And he's saying, first of all, thank you for putting this on and for making it happen. Hopefully less to overcome technically than Apollo 13. Well, I won't be the judge of that. Right. The question is, what lunar experiments ALSEP were shuffled about to cover for the aborted Apollo 13 landing, and was the short training to learn them?
Well, the lunar surface experiments were basically pushed to Apollo 14. They had an extra bit of equipment, though, which Apollo 13 didn't have, which was the MET, the Modular Equipment Transporter, basically a hand cart. The lunar rover was under development, but wouldn't be ready in time for Apollo 14. And in order to carry tools and equipment around, there's this 2-wheeled handcart that the astronauts pulled along behind them, rather than have to carry stuff in their hands, which, despite the 1/6 lunar gravity, would have been quite a struggle. One thing about the equipment, that the surface experiments was unlike Apollo 11, where they had the laser reflector, which didn't need any power, that just bounced the laser beams back to the Earth. The other large piece of equipment was the seismometer, which didn't need much power other than the battery to transmit the findings back to Earth. And that was recharged using solar panels, although it didn't survive the first lunar night, a 2-week long night. So on Apollo 12, and from that mission onwards, the equipment was powered remotely by RTGs, radioisotope thermal generator. So there was a central station, and the wires going out from that would be plugged into the various bits of equipment. And that was the same for Apollo 13. So there comes the question. Fixed in a stowage bay in the lunar module were the plutonium oxide pellets that were going to power this. And seeing as it didn't land on the moon and was going to come back to Earth, the lunar module would be jettisoned and would break up in the Earth's atmosphere. What happened to the plutonium? Well, first of all, it was inside a cask which was specially toughened to withstand a catastrophic explosion at launch. in case the astronauts had to fire the launch escape system and get themselves away from the Saturn V whilst the whole stack blew up. Precautions were made so that the cask with the plutonium would survive intact, so you wouldn't get any plutonium released into the atmosphere. And in this case, it survived re-entry, and the lunar module was deliberately targeted so that when it separated from the command module, that it would re-enter over the Pacific, and it was tracked down as it came through the atmosphere and broke up, and the cask with the plutonium is currently several miles down at the bottom of a trench in the Pacific Ocean, so not causing any problem at all.
Right, well, thank you very much, Jerry. We've got even more questions coming in now. Now, this is a slightly tricky one for you. I have sent you an email from Rick Mulhern with a picture of Fred Hayes asleep, capturing the rendezvous window. Oh, I see. So he's actually looking out the rendezvous window directly above him. Adjacent to the window and drawn with what appears to be felt pen are 4 arrows pointing at the window. Do you have any idea what these hand-drawn arrows are for?
I would imagine that those are additional markers for either for rendezvous and docking, or for star sightings. Remember that without being able to use the service module engine, that's the one which would have been used to slow the 2 spacecraft while they're docked together, to take them into lunar orbit, and then to circularize the orbit, and then to fire again to bring them back home. But with the damage to the service module, they had no way of knowing whether the engine itself was damaged, and they were worried if they tried to light the engine that it might just completely blow up. So the only available engine to them was the lunar module. So that, in fact, the lunar module had 2 engines, the descent stage engine and the ascent stage engine. And they needed to make a couple of course corrections. The first was on the way to the moon, because they had already taken themselves off what would have been a free return trajectory, which would have meant if they did nothing, they would loop around the moon and come directly back to Earth. But as they were no longer on that trajectory, they had to get themselves back on it. Otherwise, they wouldn't get back. It's as simple as that. So to do that, they had to align themselves, and they would have normally done that using the sextant and the compass in the command module. But that was powered down, so they couldn't use it. And this was portrayed in the film of Apollo 13. What are we going to use? We need a fixed point in space. And they decided on the Earth. Not the whole Earth, because that was too big. So they took the point where they could see daylight and night on Earth. And the day-night line, as on the moon, it's called the terminator. Nothing to do with Mr. Schwarzenegger. And at the point of that, so what would be the tip of the horns of a crescent, that was their specific point. And if they could line that up with a point on the window, and you can see markings on that window there, then that would give them a reference point. Now, think it's possible that these additional markings pointing to points on the window may have been to do with alignment for that, getting the spacecraft pointing the right way in preparation for one of those engine burns. Interestingly, that's an interesting picture. It's actually a composite of a few different frames put together. Either that, or now here's something else. Looking at it again, that looks pretty sharp. Okay, now astronomers will be familiar with the idea of frame stacking. When you take pictures of particularly deep space objects, galaxies and so forth, we no longer take a single picture because the chances are it'll be slightly blurred due to effects from the Earth's atmosphere. So what's done now is you take a series of pictures. You essentially take a strip of video and then put that through some software which will analyze each individual frame. It'll delete all of the blurred frames, all the ones that are out of focus, and then it'll stack the others together to produce a high quality picture. Now, somebody has done that with the 16mm film that was shot inside Apollo 13 and produced these much higher resolution images of the astronauts inside the spacecraft than we'd previously had. And I think this is a combination of some of those frames. It's a quite remarkable picture. I think we ought to put this on the Society website so everyone can see it.
Okay, thank you very much, Jerry. Right, we've got another one from, Dr. Quinton Stanley. Right, we all know him. And he says, great to see you both online and hear Jerry giving so much insight into the Apollo missions. Going on the discussion regarding Ian Crawford's comments on manned space missions, doesn't just the fact that a human is present pique one's interest? Additionally, isn't it how the crews in space and in mission control reacted that has increased our interest and hence our deep interest 50 years later?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Quentin. It's a very valid question, and I think you really hit the nail on the head. Something that I've often said is that unmanned spacecraft go out and, yes, they operate for long periods of time, and they do remarkable work, and they can go where no man has gone before. I mean, we're not going to be sending astronauts to the surface of Titan for a long time. But on the other hand, despite all that they've done, no robot spacecraft is going to come back and stand in front of an audience and tell them about their adventures. The inclusion of humans in this is a major thing, and it is just simply a continuation of what we do. We are a curious species. We go out to explore, to find out more. It was Captain Cook, or to be accurate, Lieutenant Cook at the time, who said, it was my ambition to go not as far as men had gone, but further than men had ever gone before. And this is it. We always want to keep going beyond where we have been before, to tax our own limits and to find out. And that's why we explore. We want to keep on learning. You can never say, sorry, we've learned enough, let's stop. That would be ridiculous. If we did that, we would stagnate and die, and it would be our fault. let's keep on exploring and learning and finding out. And because there's actually, I've always said there's three things that we find out from space missions. One is hopefully what we planned the mission for. Number two is things that we learn as a result of doing it. For example, Kennedy, when he made his speech at Rice University, why we go to the moon. And he's talked about we'll be going to an unexplored body using processes that we haven't devised yet, using materials and alloys that haven't even been invented yet. And that was it. We learned how to do those things as a result of preparing to go to the moon. And the third bit is things that we never planned to learn, but we do anyway. And that's what gets collectively put together in a publication from NASA that they put out each year called Spinel. And that lists only about 50 of the benefits from space exploration and space research that we never intended to find out, but we do. Better insulation for firefighters, lightweight oxygen tanks for firefighters, because a lot of them wouldn't wear oxygen tanks because they were too heavy and it made the working too difficult. And so many other things in health, construction, and so on. Even
we're going to have to move on fairly quickly, Jerry. We've got a few more questions to go.
Let's go on then.
Right. The next question is from Gabriella Shackleton. I think one of our younger members. We know her quite well. And she's saying a question for the Q&A. How accurate was the scene in Apollo 13 to restart the command module that was trialed in the simulator to avoid spiking the voltages?
Very accurate, extremely accurate. This was a major thing. They couldn't overload the batteries, otherwise they just wouldn't have the power. So all the things that they wanted to do, they had to put those all together and then pick out, first of all, which ones can you actually do without, and then what's the power loading for each one, and does it make any difference which order you do it. And then there was that bit of brilliance, John Aaron, the econ and his team, about using the wiring to effectively push the power back the other way, as it were, to get a bit more out of it. And yeah, it's again an incredible piece of work, and just shows how hard that they had to work to make it all possible. I mean, when they first went into the back room and Gene Kranz drew the trajectory on the board, looping around the moon, comes back about halfway to Earth and puts a big X and says, we've got enough power to get to there. And that's all. And we need to come all the way back to Earth. And yeah, they had to go through that. And it is really dicey, you know, as you saw what Ken Mattingly did in the simulator, checking through, running their procedures, testing them over and over until they got one that finally worked. It is not the first thing that you try. You think, oh, right, this will do it. Let's try it out. Yes, that's it. It's brilliant. No, things don't work that way in the real world. You try and you try and you try. And
right. Well, thank you, Jerry. We've got a couple more questions here. This one has come in from Fabrizio Bernardini, who heads up our BIS Italia branch, and he's in Rome, and he's got two questions. He asked, first of all, why Jack Swigert didn't fly again or remain with NASA?
Well, he'd actually already decided that he wasn't going to fly afterwards. And he subsequently he got another job, and then he went into politics, and he was actually elected to Congress, and but sadly died of leukemia just a few weeks before he was due to take office. Now, I've been to Colorado. I went out there for a Mars Society conference a few years ago, and in the airport at Colorado is a life-size statue of Jack Swigert in his spacesuit. It's a lovely tribute to him. There you go.
Well, thank you. Yes, now his second question then is, do you know if there's a good reason why in the film they didn't show the so critical first course correction, which re-established the free return trajectory essential to save the crew?
I mean, they mentioned it, and they said first thing we've got to do is get them back on the free return trajectory. But I think the other burn, after they'd looped around the moon, and they had to do another course correction, and this one really was critical as well. And they just decided, there's no point really in showing two burns. We're going to show that what is essentially the same thing twice. So we'll mention the first one, but we'll actually show the second one. And they just left it at that.
Right, well, thank you. That's probably the only answer we're going to get. Well, I think we're running almost to time. What I'd like to do is ask if there are any other questions. I've got one more a statement than anything. We've got a hi from Ange and Nigel saying a big hello to Jerry. You're looking very well. Glad to see you, and hope our BIS friends and all our members are safe and well during these exceptional times. So,
thank you, Nigel. Nigel and I, we're 45 years ago, the two of us were out at the Cape to watch the very last Apollo launch for the Apollo-Soyuz test project. And I had hoped that we might organise a get-together for anybody who went on that trip sometime in July. We might still do it. We'll have to see how the health situation continues, but it would be nice for us to get together.
Yes, well, good to hear from you, Ange and Nigel. Right, well, I think that's all I've got questions. I'll just quickly check on the email to see if there's anything more.
Okay, while you're doing that, can I recommend some books for people? Firstly, okay, All the Apollo Missions, a terrific book written by David Baker, our very own spaceflight editor, who, as I said, worked on the Apollo project. Then there's also, I mean, really, you need to get stuff from the horse's mouth, don't you? Lost Moon, co-written by Jim Lovell himself. Fantastic book if you really want to know what happened on the mission, and not just on the mission but all around it as well. Then there is well, you'll be familiar with the Haynes manuals, of course. There is this one specifically about Apollo 13. And need I say, this is also written by David Baker, as you can see down there. Now, I'm not sure how easy it is to get hold of these now, but I have a few copies of the Haynes Saturn V manual, which is absolutely terrific. Everything you ever wanted to know about this incredible rocket. And also, it's still listed as an owner's workshop manual, but this one is actually about the moon. As I said, I have a few copies of those. They are supposed to be £23 each. I can do them for less than that, along with much less than that, my own. This is my latest book in the DK Find Out series, all about space travel, and it has a section on the missions to the moon and all kinds of other information about it. And as with my other book, One Small Step, I claim this is suitable for 8-year-olds of all ages. That's just £6 plus postage. If you contact me at jerry.stone, that's Jerry with a J, jerry.stone2001, as in that poster up there, at gmail.com, I'll give you details of post and packing to go with that.
Right. We've got one more question just come in from Rick Marheim again, and he's actually asking you that very question. Does Jerry own any Apollo artifacts from the program, and which is his most prized, and can he show us?
Right. Yes, I do have some very special things. I mean, so first of all, whenever I was going to meet an astronaut, I prepare an A4 sheet of photos from their mission as a montage. So because I had put these together, they were unique to me. You couldn't buy these sheets anywhere else. And I would print out 2. And I would give one to the astronaut concerned and ask them to sign one, which I would keep. So those are very special. But I also have some medallions. Now, if I just reach up on my shelf. So this is my book that some of you will have, One Small Step. Sadly, would you believe this is out of print? I called up the distributors to order some more before Christmas, and they only had 6 left in stock. And I said, what, you mean 6 in total? They said, yes. It's very popular. And I said, well, yes, it must be, because when I called you in March, you had 850, and they've all gone. So I contacted the publishers to say, are you going to reprint it? And they said, no. And I said, but we're still going through the 50th anniversaries of all of the other missions. And by the time that is in December 2022, with the 50th anniversary of Apollo 17, we'll only be a couple of years away from going back to the moon again. People will be interested. And that wasn't enough to persuade them, which is a real shame.
Right.
So up there, this is what I want to show you. There is a photo of a medallion which I have commemorating Apollo 11. On the back of the medallion, it says, this contains metal from Columbia and Eagle. So the medallion which I have is made out of metal from the first spacecraft to land men on the moon. And that is very, very special. And I'll just show you one more thing, which is quite amazing. And I've kept these especially for tonight. Let's get a suitable one. Here we go. Right. These are my Apollo 13 newspapers. And you can see this one is dated, tomorrow, Thursday, April 16th, 1970. And there's Apollo 13 there. So it's one newspaper for each day of the flight. And I have them through Apollo, all the way through to Apollo 17. It's
13 for their accuracy. Are there any scenes that you would mention for being inaccurate?